way of describing it, isn't it? It's another country altogether. Now, the federal opposition is pushing for an early end to the government's billion-dollar stimulus spending, but yesterday Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens said the stimulus had supported Australia during the economic downturn.
And Mr Stevens disagreed with the opposition's calls to immediately rein in stimulus spending. For more, we're joined by the opposition's finance spokeswoman, Senator Helen Coonan in Sydney. Senator Coonan, good morning.
Good morning, Joe.
Now, we'll get to Glenn Stevens' comments in a minute, but first of all, the Australian report is reporting this morning that two-thirds of the Liberal Party backbench don't want Malcolm Turnbull to negotiate with the government on an ETS. Would that figure be about right?
Well, look, I think what it shows is that there's a lot of people in the coalition who are concerned that this matter is being pushed on for a vote prior to Copenhagen, when it will be clear what the rest of the world is going to do. So I think it's perfectly true to say that that is an abiding concern in the coalition. I, in fact, have that concern myself. And it's always been our preference that the vote not be pushed on by the government until we could look at what was going to happen in Copenhagen. However, if in fact Mr Rudd is going to bring this on for a vote, as he appears to, they control the government program, so clearly it requires us to look at what we can do to improve what we think is a fatally flawed piece of legislation. And Ian Macfarlane, who's got carriage of the matter on behalf of the coalition, is working very hard to try to deal with amendments that will make things immeasurably better. So one of the circumstances that I think we've got to look at is how all of us can understand this process that Ian Macfarlane is going through on behalf of Malcolm Turnbull, so that these concerns can be accommodated when we have our joint party meeting about it in a couple of weeks.
So you don't contest that figure at all, that two-thirds of the Liberal backbench probably don't support Malcolm Turnbull even negotiating with the government on this?
Well, look, I certainly am not aware that that's anything like an accurate figure. What I said was I am aware that there are a lot of people in the coalition, I'm one of them, who are very concerned that this matter is going to be debated in Parliament with really only half the facts. You need to know how the rest of the world, particularly the standard setters such as the United States, are going to react and what's going to come out of Copenhagen, so that our scheme can be calibrated in a way that reflects what the rest of the world is doing. It makes absolutely no sense that we would put at risk jobs and industries, potentially be exporting emissions in circumstances where doing it alone may not achieve those, really achieve anything for the environment and have all of those detrimental effects. So that's obviously a concern.
I'll just come in. It really does seem, though, the coalition is hopelessly divided on this. Ron Boswell has told ABC Radio that he doesn't remember the party room even agreeing to the ETS as policy before the last election. Did the coalition party room agree to an ETS before the last election?
Well, that's certainly my recollection. I was a member of the Howard government cabinet that looked very critically at Mr Shergold's report and decided that it would be our policy going forward to the election. There were obviously some differences in timing, but whether or not there was a Labor government or a coalition government, this country would be looking at the best way to deal with emissions. So my recollection is it did go to the joint party room. People obviously have different recollections, but it clearly was part of coalition policy as announced.
When you've got disagreement on an issue as basic as this, how can the coalition be seen as even having a leg to stand on in terms of arguing on this issue?
Well, look, we've put forward a number of principles that we think are absolutely critical to a proper understanding of this process. Mr Macfarlane has in fact asked the government if we can have a look at certain reports, such as the Morgan Stanley report on the impact of on the electricity industry. That, of course, hasn't been given to us. We clearly need to see the regulations, and as an opposition, that's entirely responsible, that we'd want to see how the nuts and bolts, the guts of this thing will actually work, so that you can explain it to the rest of the party. So rather than being hopelessly divided, I think what we are doing is raising reasonable questions about a process of how we can all understand what the government is going to be asking us to do before Copenhagen.
OK, we'll get on to those Senate hearings now that you were at yesterday. The Coalition dismisses Ken Henry's opinions as those of someone who has to toe the government line. You can't do that with Glenn Stevens, can you?
Well, look, I think what's very clear here is that Dr. Henry advises the government, and he advises the government on government policy as announced and as developed. So he's in a different position to Mr. Stevens, who clearly is an independent operator. So he obviously runs the monetary policy and the monetary arm.
If you recognise that he is
Dr. Henry advises on the fiscal arm.
If you do recognise that he is an independent operator, then he says he has no problem with the stimulus spending so far, and he has no problems with the level of debt. Doesn't that blow your whole argument right out of the water then?
Well, why don't we look at what he really said, which he clearly enunciated that the peak of the stimulus, the efficacy of the stimulus, has passed. It's passed because the emergency is no longer with us, thankfully. The economy is in recovery. That will mean, he said, that both fiscal and monetary policy, expansionary policy, has to be rewound. He said that there is a phase-out in the fiscal policy. That clearly goes through to about 2012 and will contribute to GDP up until 2012. He said that the government may indeed, if the economy starts heating up, have a plan B and look at either deferring or cancelling the 20 or 30 billion that they haven't yet rolled out. Reason being that that's going to allow him to keep interest rates lower for longer. Now, that's a slightly more expanded version of what he said in response to the points that you've just put to me. But let's look at the economy going forward, which is what he was asked to do. And in his forecasts, he has alluded to a plan B that the government should perhaps consider, because otherwise interest rates may not be as low as he would like to keep them for as long.
It'll have to be carefully managed. Senator Helen Coonan in Sydney, thanks very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you, Joe.